When Americans imagine the institutions that protect the country, they often picture unity, agencies working hand in hand, exchanging information effortlessly, aligned toward a single goal. But the real history between the CIA and the FBI is far more complex, shaped not by conflict or conspiracy, but by two completely different missions that were never designed to fit together neatly. What emerged over decades was not a dramatic showdown, but a quiet, persistent rivalry woven into the very structure of American national security. To understand where this tension began, you have to go back to the origins of both agencies. The FBI grew from the world of law enforcement. Its purpose was domestic stability, investigating crimes, building cases, following evidence, and working with courts. Everything the Bureau did was rooted in rules, documentation, and legal procedure. The CIA, on the other hand, was born from the global uncertainty after World War II. Its job was not to prosecute, but to understand, not to prepare cases, but to gather information abroad, analyze global trends, and provide intelligence that shaped foreign policy. Two cultures emerged. One believed in evidence, chain of custody, witness interviews, and legal standards. The other believed in analysis, human sources, secrecy, and strategic interpretation. Neither saw the other as adversarial. They simply operated from different realities. Veterans from both institutions later described the early years as a time when the agencies spoke different languages. FBI agents asked what could be proven. CIA officers asked what could be learned. The Bureau needed clarity and documentation. The agency needed flexibility and silence. These weren't opposing goals, just incompatible methods. The Cold War made this difference more visible. Global threats didn't respect borders. Domestic investigations suddenly had international dimensions. Information gathered overseas often had implications at home, and vice versa. But because the CIA and FBI had grown separately, with different priorities and oversight structures, there were few mechanisms to merge their perspectives smoothly. This didn't produce open conflict. It produced something subtler: hesitation. A sense of caution between institutions whose responsibilities were beginning to overlap. FBI officers were trained to guard information closely because releasing it prematurely could jeopardize an investigation. CIA officers were trained to protect sources because revealing them could risk lives or compromise global operations. Both sides believed they were acting responsibly. Both were right, and that made cooperation difficult. Leadership added another layer. Directors shaped institutional identity, and many were protective of their agency's autonomy. Each felt a responsibility to uphold tradition and safeguard mission integrity. This created a culture in which neither agency wanted to appear dependent on the other. As decades passed, communication systems expanded, threats evolved, and the United States entered a new era of complexity. Yet the structural differences remained. Analysts began describing the CIA and FBI as parallel lines, moving in the same direction, working toward the same general goal, but never fully intersecting in the way policymakers hoped. Still, despite all of this, officers from both sides consistently expressed respect for each other's work. The rivalry wasn't fueled by hostility, but by the difficulty of merging two different philosophies inside a national security system that had never been designed to align them from the start. And so, the invisible tension between the CIA and the FBI became part of the American landscape. Not a dramatic battle, but a long-standing institutional puzzle. Two agencies, two missions, one country, and a relationship defined by cooperation that was always necessary, but rarely effortless. As the decades moved forward, the CIA and FBI didn't just evolve as institutions. They grew into two distinct cultures. These cultures were shaped by the kinds of people they hired, the environments in which they operated, and the expectations placed on them by the government and the public. And while the agencies were meant to complement each other, their internal worlds often looked like opposite sides of the same coin. Inside the FBI, agents were trained to treat facts as the foundation of everything. Their world was built on evidence, witness interviews, affidavits, and legal standards that had to withstand scrutiny in courtrooms. Their success depended on precision, documentation, and the ability to justify every step in an investigation. This gave the FBI a culture of structure, predictable, methodical, and anchored in the letter of the law. Inside the CIA, the environment was completely different. Officers were taught that information rarely comes in clean lines, neatly arranged or easily documented. Instead, they learned to interpret incomplete data, assess human motivations, navigate cultural contexts, and draw conclusions from fragments. Their work relied on intuition, adaptability, and the skill of reading between the lines. The CIA's culture became one of flexibility, fluid, analytical, and shaped by uncertainty. Neither approach was superior. They were simply designed for different kinds of challenges. But as global events became more interconnected, the differences between these two cultures created friction. The FBI expected intelligence to come with verifiable details that could be used in formal investigations. The CIA dealt with information that was often ambiguous, sensitive, or impossible to confirm immediately. When these perspectives met, misunderstandings followed. Former officials often described meetings where both sides walked away feeling they had spoken clearly, only to realize weeks later that they had interpreted the same intelligence in completely different ways. It wasn't personal, it was cultural. The FBI heard evidence, the CIA heard signals, the Bureau looked for proof, the agency looked for patterns. They weren't contradicting each other. They were operating from two different philosophies of truth. These differences deepened as new generations entered each agency. Younger FBI agents embraced technology, databases, and forensic methods. Younger CIA officers trained in geopolitics, foreign languages, and global analysis. They were solving different pieces of the same puzzle, but they rarely saw the full picture from the same angle. Even vocabulary created barriers. Something labeled preliminary by the CIA might be interpreted as insufficient by the FBI. Something categorized as sensitive by the FBI might be viewed as actionable by the CIA. Both agencies meant well, but their words carried different weight in different rooms. The challenge was not lack of effort. Both agencies developed programs to improve coordination, created joint task forces, and introduced shared communication channels. But culture is powerful. Culture influences decisions, shapes instincts, and defines what each organization considers success. And at times, cultural pride worked against collaboration. Each agency believed deeply in its mission. Each felt responsible for safeguarding the nation in its own way. Each wanted to maintain its independence and identity. These instincts made cooperation careful and sometimes cautious. Officers on both sides often hesitated to share information too quickly, not out of secrecy, but out of fear of misinterpretation or operational complications. A piece of intelligence shared at the wrong time could disrupt an investigation or compromise a source. Both sides understood this, which led to a careful, measured relationship rather than a free flow of information. Over time, these cultural differences became part of the institutional DNA of both agencies. The rivalry wasn't emotional, it was procedural. It lived in the way each agency trained its people, defined its priorities, and evaluated its own success. And because these structures were deeply rooted, changing them required far more than policy adjustments. It required a shift in how both agencies understood themselves. Despite these differences, the shared goal remained constant. Both the CIA and the FBI wanted to protect the United States. Their rivalry never changed that. What it did change was the way each agency approached that mission, through different lenses, guided by different instincts, shaped by different histories. That contrast became the heart of their relationship. Two cultures, standing side by side, working toward the same destination while walking along different paths. As the Cold War intensified and the world entered an age defined by shifting alliances, rapid technology, and unseen threats, the paths of the CIA and FBI began to cross more often than either agency expected. What had once been two separate missions slowly became overlapping responsibilities, not because of structural reform, but because global events pushed both agencies into the same strategic space. For decades, the FBI focused on the internal landscape of the United States, while the CIA operated almost exclusively outside its borders. But the world was changing. Information no longer moved slowly through diplomatic channels. People, communications, and ideas crossed continents in hours, not weeks. The line between foreign and domestic concerns began to dissolve, and both agencies found themselves confronting challenges that were neither purely international nor purely internal. This shift created a quiet pressure on both institutions. They needed each other more than ever, but they were not built for seamless cooperation. FBI investigators relied on evidence that could withstand scrutiny in American courts. CIA analysts relied on insights that emerged from sources who could never be named publicly. The FBI needed documentation, the CIA needed discretion. As the global landscape transformed, these two requirements collided with increasing frequency. Officials from that era often described the relationship as a constant negotiation. The FBI wanted clarity, hard data, and proven connections. The CIA operated in a world where clarity was rare, and certainty was often impossible. Both agencies were trying to protect the country, yet their worlds were built on opposite assumptions about how information should behave. In Washington, policymakers urged deeper cooperation. Reports recommended unified frameworks, shared systems, and more integrated analysis. But cooperation was never just a matter of policy. It was a matter of institutional instinct, and instincts take time to change. Inside the CIA, officers were accustomed to making decisions with partial information. They were trained to connect dots that were not fully visible, to interpret subtle patterns, and to anticipate geopolitical shifts before they could be confirmed. This mindset allowed them to operate in the fluid, unpredictable world of foreign intelligence. Inside the FBI, decisions required confirmation. Agents needed facts, timestamps, witness statements, and clear documentation. Their work revolved around courts, where even the smallest misstep could weaken a case. The FBI's mindset was built on accuracy, verification, and accountability within strict legal boundaries. When these two philosophies met, the result was rarely conflict. It was hesitation. Both sides understood the risks of miscommunication. A prematurely shared lead could disrupt months of investigative work. A misunderstood piece of intelligence could cause misinterpretations. Officers often preferred caution over speed, hoping to avoid unintended consequences. As global events continued to accelerate, these differences became more visible. Some intelligence arrived too quickly for the FBI to verify. Some domestic findings were too sensitive for the CIA to act on without risking foreign relationships. Information moved in loops rather than straight lines. and the agencies found themselves constantly adjusting to realities they had not trained for. Veterans from both agencies later explained that the real challenge wasn't secrecy, it was interpretation. Two analysts from different agencies could read the same piece of information and walk away with entirely different conclusions. One would see a legal thread worth following, the other would see a geopolitical signal worth monitoring. Neither was wrong, but their perspectives moved in different directions. Meanwhile, leadership on both sides continued to shape the relationship. Some directors emphasized collaboration and encouraged open communication. Others emphasized independence, worried that too much overlap would dilute each agency's core mission. These changing leadership philosophies created an ebb and flow in the relationship. Times of smoother cooperation, followed by periods of careful separation. And through it all, the world outside kept evolving. New technologies emerged, new kinds of threats appeared, new patterns of communication developed. The clear borders that once defined each agency's responsibilities became more blurred with every passing year. By the end of this period, the CIA and FBI were still distinct institutions with distinct purposes, but their missions were closer than ever. They were navigating the same complex world from different angles, trying to interpret signals that no agency could fully understand alone. Their relationship remained defined by respect, caution, and the constant challenge of aligning two different types of intelligence under one national framework. As the 20th century moved forward, the CIA and the FBI entered a period when their missions were no longer neatly separated by geography. The world had become too interconnected for foreign and domestic intelligence to exist in isolation. Threats traveled across borders with unprecedented speed, and the United States needed cooperation between its two major intelligence institutions more than ever. But cooperation is never simply a matter of intent. It is shaped by habits, internal rules, and the deep cultural identities each agency builds over decades. Inside government, policymakers began to recognize that the CIA's global reach and the FBI's domestic insight were complementary in theory, but difficult to align in practice. Reports circulated, committees met, and recommendations were drafted. Yet the fundamental differences that defined each agency remained intact. Change could be encouraged, but culture could not be rewritten overnight. The FBI's approach was rooted in structure. Every investigation followed a defined path, every piece of evidence needed verification, every step required documentation. The Bureau moved within the precise limits of legal procedure, which protected its credibility, but also required a deliberate pace. Agents often emphasized accuracy over speed, ensuring that the information they used was solid enough to support formal action. The CIA's world operated on a different clock. Global intelligence rarely arrived in tidy packages. Analysts had to work with fragments, signals, indirect clues, and sources who could not be revealed. Their work demanded constant interpretation and a willingness to draw conclusions from incomplete information. They needed flexibility to respond to changes that could occur suddenly and unpredictably. In their environment, waiting for perfect certainty often meant arriving too late. These two mindsets were not opposites. They were reflections of the different purposes each agency served. Yet when the FBI and CIA attempted to merge their perspectives, even briefly, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Information that the CIA considered urgent might seem unconfirmed to the FBI. Data the FBI treated as foundational could appear too narrow for the CIA to act upon internationally. Each agency respected the other's approach, but their internal logic pulled them in different directions. Communication between the agencies improved gradually, but always with careful boundaries. Officers who worked at the intersection of the two institutions often described their roles as translators, not of language, but of mindset. They had to explain why certain information mattered, why certain details were incomplete, why a piece of intelligence required discretion, or why a lead required verification. These explanations were necessary because each agency interpreted risk differently. The FBI saw risk in acting too soon, jeopardizing a legal case or compromising evidence. The CIA saw risk in acting too late, losing the chance to understand or influence events unfolding abroad. These perspectives came from their missions, not from rivalry. But when missions differ, priorities differ. And when priorities differ, cooperation requires careful negotiation. Meanwhile, the world continued to evolve. Technology transformed how information traveled. Communication moved from paper to digital networks. Signals that once took days to reach analysts now arrived instantly. But speed did not simplify intelligence, it complicated it. Analysts had more data, more noise, more signals to interpret. Both agencies faced the same challenge. Information was abundant, but clarity was scarce. In this environment, the CIA and FBI found themselves working parallel to each other more often than ever before. They encountered the same names, the same patterns, the same global shifts viewed from different vantage points. Their missions intersected naturally, even if their methods did not. Yet despite the complexity, collaboration did not break down. It continued in quiet, systematic ways. Officers exchanged information through formal channels, briefed each other during interagency meetings, and shared analysis when national leadership required it. Respect remained strong between individuals, even if institutional friction persisted. The invisible rivalry wasn't built on conflict, it was built on structure. One agency protected the country by interpreting the world, the other protected it by enforcing the law. Their paths crossed because the world demanded it, not because they sought to challenge each other. As the century approached its final years, observers noted that the CIA and FBI were still distinct, still independent, still guided by different instincts. But they were also more connected than ever before, drawn together by a global landscape that offered fewer and fewer clear boundaries. Their relationship became a reflection of the era itself, complex, layered, cautious, and indispensable. The deeper you look into the history of the CIA and FBI, the clearer it becomes that their relationship was influenced as much by leadership philosophy as by mission differences. Directors on both sides left strong marks on the identity of their agencies, sometimes pulling them closer together, sometimes reinforcing the walls that kept them apart. The rivalry was not simply structural, it was personal, in the sense that leaders defined what cooperation meant within their own walls. Inside the FBI, generations of leadership cultivated a disciplined, rule-driven environment. Directors emphasized procedure, legal integrity, and the importance of protecting ongoing investigations from outside interference. This wasn't about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was about ensuring that cases remained strong, defensible, and free from external influence. Bureau culture encouraged caution, careful communication, and an instinct to guard information until it was fully verified. At the CIA, leadership evolved under a very different set of pressures. Directors responded to global events, shifting alliances, and the constant need to understand motivations far beyond America's borders. Their world moved quickly, often unpredictably, and required flexibility that did not always fit neatly into formal processes. The agency's leadership promoted adaptability, rapid response, and an analytical mindset that accepted uncertainty as an unavoidable part of gathering intelligence abroad. These opposing definitions of responsibility shaped how each agency viewed cooperation. For the FBI, collaboration meant bringing others into a system built on discipline and clarity. For the CIA, it meant preserving the fluidity necessary to operate effectively in a world where certainty was rare. Leadership reinforced these instincts, and over time, the distance between the two organizations became a familiar feature of Washington's landscape. Even when cooperation improved, it required constant attention. Directors needed to encourage communication without compromising their agency's internal mission, and this balancing act became a defining part of interagency relations. Officers who served during these eras often described meetings where both agencies sat at the same table, yet seemed to inhabit different tempos. The FBI approached information in a linear way, breaking it into facts, timelines, and evidence. The CIA approached it from multiple angles, examining motives, international context, and larger geopolitical implications. Both approaches were valid, but merging them required patience and a willingness to understand the other's logic. Leadership styles influenced how often such understanding emerged. Some directors were natural bridge builders, encouraging joint programs, shared training, and open communication. Others valued institutional independence and preferred to limit how deeply the two agencies intertwined. These shifts created waves of cooperation that rose and fell from decade to decade, leaving the relationship in a constant state of adjustment rather than stasis. Inside the agencies, officers learned to adapt to these changes. When leadership encouraged unity, internal teams worked more fluidly with outside counterparts. When leadership reinforced autonomy, communication tightened again and became more selective. Officers respected the decisions of their directors, but these shifts sometimes required them to reevaluate how they approached collaboration on a personal level. What makes this era of the CIA-FBI relationship particularly fascinating is how much of it unfolded behind closed doors, not in dramatic moments, but in the everyday rhythm of institutional life. Analysts wrote reports shaped by their agency's philosophy. Investigators framed requests using their agency's expectations. Leaders set priorities that shaped tone and culture. And every one of these actions contributed to the invisible boundary between the agencies. This boundary didn't weaken their ability to protect the country, but it did define how they communicated. Information moved, but carefully. Insights were shared, but selectively. Collaboration happened, but only when both sides understood the stakes and the limitations of each other's systems. The rivalry remained quiet because it was rooted not in conflict, but in caution. As the 20th century approached its final decade, a new understanding began to take shape within Washington. The rivalry wasn't an obstacle to be eliminated, but a reality to be managed. The agencies had different missions because the world required them to. The challenge was not to merge them, but to help them move in parallel without drifting too far apart. The leadership that guided both agencies during this period recognized something essential. Structure creates separation, but understanding creates alignment. And alignment, even imperfect, was often enough to keep the country safe in a world that offered few easy answers. As the 20th century moved into its final decades, the world experienced a technological shift so profound that it permanently altered how intelligence was gathered, processed, and understood. For the CIA and FBI, this change was not optional. It was a force that reshaped their work from the inside out. The rivalry that had once been driven by culture and mission now faced a new layer of complexity: the speed of information itself. In earlier decades, intelligence moved slowly. Reports traveled through diplomatic channels, handwritten notes, coded messages, or physical transport. Investigators built cases with interviews, documents, and months of fieldwork. Analysts pieced together global developments from sources scattered across different continents. There was time to breathe, time to interpret, time to reconsider. Technology took that time away. By the 1980s and 1990s, information arrived instantly, raw, unfiltered, and overwhelming. Communication networks connected people across continents in seconds. Data moved faster than analysis could keep up. Signals multiplied, patterns shifted quickly, and both agencies were suddenly operating in an environment where reacting too slowly could be as risky as acting too quickly. Inside the FBI, this new reality challenged the structure that had defined the Bureau for decades. Cases that once unfolded over months now required rapid responses. Digital evidence demanded new skills, new tools, new training. Investigators had to develop expertise not only in traditional law enforcement, but in understanding emerging technologies that shaped criminal and national security landscapes. The FBI expanded its technical units, built cyber capabilities, and created systems to track information that no longer lived on paper. Inside the CIA, technology transformed the intelligence cycle even more dramatically. Analysts were no longer interpreting a limited stream of reports. They were drowning in data. Satellite imagery, digital communication, rapid information exchange, and emerging electronic networks forced the agency to rethink how intelligence was filtered, verified, and prioritized. Officers had to learn how to extract meaning from enormous volumes of information that arrived without context and changed constantly. This era introduced pressures that neither agency had faced before. Speed became essential. Accuracy remained essential. And the challenge was to maintain both without compromising mission integrity. For the relationship between the CIA and FBI, technology acted as both a bridge and a barrier. On one hand, it created opportunities for joint systems, shared databases, and cooperative analysis. On the other, it magnified the philosophical differences that had always existed between the agencies. The FBI wanted clear evidence before acting. The CIA wanted early insight before events unfolded. Technology offered unprecedented access to information, but it also highlighted how differently each agency interpreted that information. The digital age also introduced new kinds of threats that existed simultaneously in domestic and international spaces. Communications crossed borders effortlessly. Financial networks moved through global systems. Technology companies operated in multiple countries at once. For the first time, the distinction between foreign and domestic activity was not just blurred. It was sometimes irrelevant. A single piece of intelligence could matter to both agencies at the same time, but for different reasons. This overlap forced the CIA and FBI to reconsider how they defined cooperation. They could no longer afford long delays or gaps in interpretation. Information had to move more smoothly, more consistently, with less hesitation. But moving quickly required trust, and trust required understanding. Understanding that each agency's instincts were shaped not by reluctance, but by responsibility. Inside both institutions, officers began to acknowledge that technology demanded new forms of collaboration. Joint task forces expanded. Analysts were cross-trained. Liaison roles became more central. The agencies were not merging, and they never sought to, but they were learning how to share space in a digital world where silence could create vulnerabilities. Even so, the rivalry remained, quieter, but not gone. It lived in cautious communication, in careful decision-making, in the need to balance speed with accuracy. It lived in the effort to respect each agency's boundaries, while recognizing that the modern world often ignored those boundaries entirely. What emerged during this period was a new understanding. The rivalry between the CIA and FBI was no longer simply a matter of culture or leadership. It had become a structural challenge, shaped by a world where technology outpaced tradition. Both agencies had to evolve, sometimes faster than they were comfortable with, and the way they adapted would define their relationship for decades to come. As the digital age soaked deeper into American life, something else changed alongside the CIA and FBI: the nature of national threats themselves. The United States entered a period when challenges no longer fit neatly into categories, and both agencies found themselves studying the same global developments from opposite directions. Their missions hadn't changed, but the world around them had, and that world left less room for separation. Inside the FBI, agents confronted an evolving domestic landscape shaped by technology, shifting networks, and new forms of communication that didn't exist when the Bureau first defined its procedures. Investigations were no longer confined to physical trails or traditional evidence. Digital traces spread across devices, servers, and international systems. Agents had to understand technologies that barely had names a decade earlier, and many of the clues they analyzed were connected to activities that reached far beyond American borders. Inside the CIA, analysts faced the same transformations from the other side. Their world no longer consisted solely of foreign governments, diplomats, and traditional intelligence networks. They were now observing decentralized movements, fast-moving global trends, and complex information streams shaped by both individuals and institutions. The meaning of international had expanded dramatically, and the agency had to interpret signals that were influenced as much by domestic behavior as by geopolitical developments. This created a unique kind of overlap. Two agencies analyzing different pieces of the same events, often without realizing how connected those pieces truly were. Former officials explained that the core of the challenge was perspective. The FBI approached intelligence with the mindset of investigators trying to identify facts that would have consequences inside the United States. The CIA approached intelligence as analysts trying to understand why events were unfolding abroad and how they fit into global patterns. When the same information reached both agencies, each interpreted it through its own lens. A communication intercepted overseas might seem like a foreign trend to the CIA, but could appear relevant to domestic activity from the FBI's viewpoint. A pattern observed inside the U.S. might signal potential risk for the Bureau, while the agency viewed the same pattern as part of a broader geopolitical shift. Each conclusion was logical within its own framework. This difference didn't create hostility. It created caution. Officers understood that interpreting intelligence incorrectly could have significant consequences. Both agencies were responsible for protecting the country, and both carried the weight of that responsibility in their decision-making. As global events became more intertwined, policymakers pushed for more integrated analysis. Meetings grew more frequent, joint teams expanded, and interagency communication intensified. Yet the disparity in how information was processed remained. Even when officers shared the same data, their interpretations reflected their training, priorities, and institutional DNA. Some analysts described this era as a constant exercise in translation, not of language, but of perspective. They had to explain why a signal mattered, how a pattern fit into broader trends, or why a piece of intelligence required immediate attention. These explanations took time and understanding, because what appeared urgent to one agency might seem preliminary to the other. The CIA valued early awareness. The FBI valued confirmed evidence. Both values were essential, but they created different timelines for action. Technology magnified this divide. Information moved faster than deliberation. Analysts received data in real time, long before context could be established. They had to decide what was noise and what was signal. The CIA often favored interpreting information early to anticipate global movement. The FBI often favored verifying information to prevent misinterpretation in a legal environment. Both approaches were rational, and both occasionally clashed with the pace of the modern world. Despite these differences, cooperation continued to strengthen. Officers who worked across agencies described a sense of mutual respect, rooted in a shared understanding of responsibility. They acknowledged the complexity of modern threats and recognized that neither agency could address them alone. Collaboration was no longer a choice. It was an operational necessity. At the same time, the rivalry persisted quietly, living in the instinctive caution each agency applied when dealing with the other's information. It wasn't a rivalry of pride or ideology, but of methodology, a careful, structural tension shaped by the question of how best to interpret the world at a moment when the world refused to stay still. By the end of the century, the relationship between the CIA and FBI had become a mix of cooperation, caution, and contrast. Two agencies navigating the same landscape with different maps, each carrying responsibilities too significant to abandon their own ways of understanding. One of the quieter realities behind the CIA-FBI relationship is how deeply each agency valued its autonomy. They didn't guard their independence out of pride or rivalry, but out of a belief that their mission required freedom from certain constraints. Over time, this instinct became part of their institutional identity, an invisible line that neither agency crossed without careful thought. It was this line, more than any dramatic disagreement, that defined the rhythm of their cooperation. Inside the FBI, autonomy was tied to responsibility. Agents were accountable not only to the institution, but to the justice system itself. Every investigation had to stand on its own, supported by documentation and evidence strong enough to hold up in court. This meant controlling the flow of information, maintaining strict standards, and ensuring that outside influence could not undermine a case. Protecting autonomy meant protecting integrity. Inside the CIA, autonomy served a different purpose. Intelligence gathering depended on discretion, flexibility, and the ability to act without the constraints of legal procedure. Officers operated in environments where sources needed protection, where relationships were fragile, and where strategies had to adapt quickly to global events. Autonomy allowed the CIA to navigate a world where transparency could be dangerous and hesitation could be costly. These two definitions of independence shaped how each agency interacted with the other. The FBI hesitated to share too early, fearing that unverified information might disrupt an investigation. The CIA hesitated to share too broadly, fearing that sensitive intelligence might lose context or compromise a source. Both concerns were legitimate. Both reflected loyalty to mission, not distrust of the other institution. This dynamic produced a rhythm of cooperation that was steady but cautious. Information moved, but in carefully managed steps. Meetings happened, but with clear limits on what could be discussed. Analysts exchanged insights, but always with an awareness of what must remain inside their own agency's walls. Officers who worked at the boundary between the two organizations learned to navigate this environment with precision, understanding not just what to share, but how and when to share it. The invisible line between them wasn't static. It shifted depending on leadership, global events, and national priorities. Some directors encouraged broader collaboration, softening the boundaries. Others reinforced autonomy, reminding their agencies of the importance of protecting their core mission. These shifts meant that officers lived in a constant state of adaptation, learning to read not just intelligence, but institutional tone. Even when cooperation increased, the line never disappeared entirely. The FBI still protected the legal foundation of its work. The CIA still protected the secrecy on which its operations depended. Both agencies understood that stepping too far into the other's space could create operational complications or unintended consequences. Respecting that boundary was not about rivalry. It was about responsibility. Analysts and investigators who lived through this era often described their interactions as a balancing act. They had to think not only about what information meant, but about how the other agency would interpret it. A single detail that seemed minor to one side could be pivotal to the other. Officers learned to explain context, clarify assumptions, and sometimes even translate their institutional language into something the other agency could use. What made this period especially challenging was the speed at which the world was changing. Technology blurred the line between foreign and domestic activity. Communication networks moved across borders effortlessly. Businesses operated globally. Financial flows crossed continents. A threat could originate in one part of the world, develop in another, and appear in the United States without warning. Both the CIA and FBI needed to understand the bigger picture, but they approached that picture from opposite directions. This situation required a degree of mutual reliance that both agencies recognized, even if they did not always articulate it. Neither could fulfill its mission alone. The CIA needed domestic insights to understand global patterns. The FBI needed foreign intelligence to frame domestic investigations. Their worlds overlapped whether they wanted them to or not. And yet the rivalry persisted, quiet, steady, almost structural. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't secrecy. It was simply the tension created when two powerful institutions, each with its own mission and identity, were asked to share a space not originally designed for cooperation. By the end of this era, the CIA and FBI had developed something that resembled a disciplined coexistence. Not unity, not division, but a careful line drawn between two missions under the same flag. This line was never about competition. It was about maintaining the integrity of systems that protected America in different, equally essential ways. By the late 20th century, the relationship between the CIA and the FBI had settled into something unique within the American government, a partnership defined as much by shared goals as by the different speeds at which each agency operated. The world was moving faster each year, and both institutions were racing to keep up, just not always in the same way or at the same time. Inside the FBI, speed was shaped by process. Investigations unfolded in stages, and each stage required precise action. Gathering evidence, coordinating with prosecutors, and building cases that could survive judicial scrutiny meant that timing mattered. Acting too quickly could jeopardize the structure of an investigation. Acting too slowly could allow important details to disappear. The Bureau moved in controlled increments, maintaining a rhythm that had worked for decades. Inside the CIA, speed meant something entirely different. Intelligence had to be interpreted as it arrived, not when it was convenient. Analysts needed to recognize patterns before they became obvious, anticipate events before they materialized, and piece together global behavior while the world was still shifting. Waiting too long could mean missing the early signals that defined larger geopolitical movements. The agency moved with fluidity, adjusting to uncertainty as part of its routine. This difference in pacing created a quiet, persistent tension. The FBI needed time for accuracy. The CIA needed motion for awareness. Both approaches made sense, but not always in harmony. Officers from both agencies recalled moments when their timelines collided. The CIA might share intelligence that appeared urgent from a global perspective, but lacked the verification the FBI required to act domestically. The FBI might uncover information that demanded careful legal handling, while the CIA viewed the same information as part of a broader international trend, requiring immediate analysis. Neither side was wrong. They were simply calibrated differently. These differences shaped how each agency interpreted risk. For the FBI, the biggest risk was acting prematurely and undermining a case. For the CIA, the biggest risk was acting too late and missing a global shift. Risk lived at opposite ends of the timeline. Coordination required patience and an understanding that pace was not a reflection of commitment, but of mission. Technology complicated this even further. Digital information arrived instantly, but the meaning behind that information was rarely instant. The speed at which data reached analysts increased dramatically. Yet the speed at which conclusions could responsibly be drawn did not always match. Both agencies found themselves receiving more information than they could quickly interpret. This made timing even more sensitive. The CIA needed to act early to inform policymakers. The FBI needed to act carefully to support legal consequences, and both needed to avoid missteps that could compromise national security or disrupt sensitive operations. To manage these challenges, interagency communication expanded. Officers spent more time in joint meetings, shared secure systems, and worked on parallel analyses. But even in these collaborative spaces, the difference in pacing was visible. The CIA often pushed to anticipate, the FBI often pushed to verify. Each push came from responsibility, not rivalry. Some officials described the cooperation as a synchronized dance, one in which both partners knew the steps, but not always at the same tempo. Small adjustments were needed constantly, explaining why a detail mattered, clarifying what remained unknown, defining what required urgency and what required patience. These adjustments didn't slow the process. They made it possible. The speed difference also shaped internal culture. CIA analysts were trained to consider possibilities, even improbable ones, because global uncertainty required broad interpretation. FBI investigators were trained to narrow possibilities, focusing on what could be proven beyond doubt. One agency expanded the frame, the other refined it. When these approaches met, they created a fuller picture, but only when both sides recognized what the other contributed. By this period, the rivalry between the CIA and FBI was no longer driven by the idea of independence alone. It was driven by the simple fact that two missions, equally important, required different rhythms. In practice, this meant occasional friction, occasional hesitation, but also a mutual respect that deepened with each shared challenge. Officers who worked across agencies consistently emphasized that the rivalry was rarely emotional. It lived in timing, not conflict. It lived in analysis, not disagreement. It lived in the different energy each agency brought to the same problem. And through all this, one truth remained constant. The CIA and FBI protected the same nation, but they did so from two ends of one spectrum, one watching the horizon, the other watching the ground beneath it. Their speeds differed, their instincts differed, but their purpose did not. By the time the century drew to a close, this dual-speed system had become part of America's security structure. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, a careful balance between anticipation and confirmation, between global awareness and domestic protection. By the time the United States stepped into the 21st century, the relationship between the CIA and the FBI had become one of the most enduring features of the American security landscape. Not a temporary misunderstanding, not an accidental friction, but a structural reality shaped by decades of evolution. The rivalry never erupted into open conflict, yet it never fully disappeared. It settled into the foundation of both institutions, quiet but unmistakable. woven into the fabric of how the country protected itself. What made this rivalry unique was that it was never ideological. It wasn't personal. It wasn't emotional. It was the natural consequence of asking two very different organizations to guard the same nation in completely different ways. Each agency developed its identity through responsibility. Responsibility to law, responsibility to intelligence, responsibility to history, responsibility to the demands of a rapidly changing world. The FBI saw itself as the guardian of internal order. Its purpose was rooted in clarity, documentation, procedure, and the belief that justice must be both accurate and accountable. The Bureau protected the country by ensuring that facts could hold up in court, that investigations were executed carefully, and that the rules governing American life were upheld with discipline. The CIA saw itself as the interpreter of global uncertainty. Its purpose was to understand the world beyond American borders, to notice shifts that others might miss, and to anticipate developments before they became crises. The agency protected the country by recognizing patterns early, by reading signals from afar, and by offering a window into a world that never stopped changing. As these missions grew more intertwined, their differences became even more visible. One agency relied on what could be proven. The other relied on what could be anticipated. One worked within legal frameworks. The other navigated geopolitical ambiguity. One needed certainty. The other worked within uncertainty. These differences weren't flaws. They were built into the design. Yet, as institutional as the rivalry was, it also carried a quiet form of respect. Officers from both agencies often described the other side in practical, even admiring terms. The FBI valued the CIA's ability to see the bigger picture. The CIA valued the FBI's ability to ground information in concrete evidence. Both agencies understood that the other possessed strengths they did not, and that these strengths were essential to national security. What kept the rivalry alive was not disagreement, but the simple reality that cooperation required navigating two sets of instincts that had been cultivated over decades. Each agency trusted its own methods because those methods had been tested by history. They protected their internal structures because those structures defined their effectiveness. And even when collaboration improved, it had to be balanced carefully with the need to preserve mission integrity. Another truth defined this relationship. The world around them changed whether the agencies were ready or not. Technology accelerated, global communication networks expanded, and threats moved across borders with unprecedented fluidity. The CIA and FBI had no choice but to work side by side, even when their instincts pulled them in different directions. The result was not unity and not division, but coexistence, a disciplined partnership shaped by caution, necessity, and an evolving understanding of each other's roles. By the late 20th century, this coexistence had matured into something stable. The agencies didn't blend. They aligned when needed. They didn't merge. They complemented one another under pressure. They didn't erase the invisible boundary between them. They learned to operate on both sides of it. Officers who served across multiple decades often described the relationship not as a conflict, but as a tension that had to be managed with care, communication, and professionalism. What emerged from all of this was a dual institution system that reflected the complexity of the country it served. The United States is vast, interconnected, and shaped by forces both internal and external. No single agency could ever capture the full picture. The CIA and FBI, operating in parallel, provided the two vantage points necessary to understand and protect a nation influenced by both domestic reality and global dynamics. The rivalry between them became a reminder of something fundamental. that national security is not a single mission, but a collection of missions that overlap, diverge, intersect, and require different forms of expertise. The tension between the two agencies was, in many ways, the tension inherent in the country's position in the world, part domestic, part global, part legal structure, part strategic interpretation. And in that sense, the rivalry was never a weakness. It was a reflection of complexity, a reflection of responsibility, a reflection of how the United States evolved. Two agencies, two philosophies, two histories, working separately, yet serving the same nation, each carrying a piece of the puzzle the other could not complete alone. This was never a war. It was a balancing act. Quiet, constant, and essential.